December 16th, 1985. Outside Sparks Steakhouse in Manhattan, gunshots break the winter silence. The sidewalks shine with a thin layer of ice, showing the neon glow of Christmas decorations that line East 46th Street. Rush hour traffic moves in its usual busy rhythm. But in less than 60 seconds, everything will change forever. The most powerful crime boss in America lies dead on the sidewalk, his blood mixing with the December slush. And standing in the shadows, planning it all, is a man who would become both America's most famous gangster and its most wanted criminal. This is the rise and fall of John Gotti, the last of the old-school mob bosses. The killing of Paul Castellano was not just a murder. It was a revolution. It marked the end of one time of organized crime and the violent birth of another. The man who ordered this hit would spend the next 17 years living a life that seemed torn from the pages of a Hollywood script, complete with designer suits, media attention, courtroom drama, and finally a fall as big as his rise. But to understand that December night in 1985, we must go back to the beginning, to a small apartment in the Bronx, where a boy named John Joseph Gotti Jr. was born into poverty, violence, and a world where loyalty meant everything and betrayal meant death. Before we dive into this amazing true story, let me know in the comments, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? If you are settling in for this complete 3-hour journey through the life of the Teflon Don, hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Trust me, you will not want to miss a single detail of this story. The story begins on October 27, 1940, in a cramped apartment in the Bronx. John Joseph Gotti Jr. enters the world as the fifth of 13 children. Born to John Joseph Gotti Sr. and Philomena Fanny DiCarlo, the Gotti household is full of controlled chaos. Too many mouths to feed, not enough money to go around, and a father who struggles with gambling problems and cannot hold steady work. John Sr. moves his family often, chasing work chances that never quite work out. The constant moves teach young Johnny a basic lesson about life. Nothing is permanent except family. And even family can disappear if you are not strong enough to hold it together. The family's most important move comes when Johnny is 12 years old. They leave the Bronx for Brooklyn, settling in the working-class neighborhood of East New York. The move places them directly in the heart of territory, controlled by the Gambino crime family. Though young Johnny does not yet understand how important this location is, East New York in the 1950s is a neighborhood in transition. Italian, Irish, and Jewish families live side by side in an uneasy mixture of cooperation and competition. The legal businesses, grocery stores, barbershops, social clubs operate alongside less legal businesses. Young boys learn early that there are two sets of rules, the ones taught in school and church, and the ones that actually control the streets. Johnny Gotti is a natural leader. Even as a child, he is charming, fearless, and has a natural understanding of human nature that will serve him throughout his life. He can read people, their fears, their desires, their weaknesses. More importantly, he learns how to use this information to get what he wants. His first taste of organized crime comes through neighborhood kids, whose fathers work for the various crime families that control Brooklyn. These men dress better than his father, drive nicer cars, and get respect wherever they go. They represent everything that Johnny's legal family life lacks: power, money, and most importantly, respect. The boy's criminal education begins with small-time street hustles. He learns to run numbers, steal from local shops, and organize other kids into crews for bigger schemes. By age 14, he is regularly skipping school to pursue these more money-making activities. His first serious problem with the law comes at age 16, when he is arrested for trying to steal construction equipment from a job site in Queens. The arresting officers are struck by the teenager's calm behavior. He does not cry, does not make excuses, does not beg for mercy. He takes his punishment with the calm acceptance of someone much older. The arrest leads to time in reform school, which serves as a training school for Johnny's criminal education. Here, he meets kids from across New York's boroughs, each bringing knowledge of different criminal businesses and family structures. He learns about the ranks that control organized crime, the codes of conduct that separate common criminals from men of respect, and most importantly, the value of keeping one's mouth shut. Reform school also introduces Johnny to violence as a tool of moving up. He learns to fight not just with his fists, but with makeshift weapons, mind games, and smart thinking. He discovers that reputation is everything in this world, that being known as someone who does not back down is worth more than being known as someone who wins every fight. When Johnny is released from reform school at 17, he returns to East New York a changed person. The boy who left was angry and lost. The young man who returns has found his calling. He begins to dress better, speak more carefully, and carry himself with the confidence of someone who knows exactly where he is going. Johnny Gotti's formal introduction to the Gambino crime family comes through neighborhood connections and careful building of relationships with established criminals. The Gambino family in 1960 is not yet the most powerful of New York's 5 families, but it is growing under the leadership of Carlo Gambino, a Sicilian immigrant who understands both old world traditions and new world opportunities. Gotti's entry into organized crime follows the traditional path. He starts as an associate, proving his worth through successful completion of increasingly important jobs. His first jobs involve collecting debts for loan sharks, providing muscle for labor disputes, and running small-scale gambling operations in Queens. What sets Gotti apart from other young criminals is his ability to make money. While other associates focus on traditional mob activities like numbers running and truck hijacking, Gotti shows a business spirit that impresses his bosses. He organizes detailed truck stealing operations, targeting specific loads of valuable goods. He develops relationships with workers at Kennedy Airport, creating pipelines for stolen goods that make steady money. Most importantly, Gotti shows complete loyalty to the family structure. When arrested, he never cooperates with law enforcement. When questioned about family business, he stays completely silent. When asked to take blame for crimes he did not commit to protect higher-ranking family members, he does so without complaint. This loyalty catches the attention of Aniello Neil Delacroce, one of the most respected capos in the Gambino family. Delacroce becomes Gotti's teacher, teaching him the subtle arts of leadership, negotiation, and smart thinking that separates successful crime bosses from street-level thugs. Under Delacroce's teaching, Gotti learns that successful organized crime is about much more than violence and threats. It requires political connections, legal business investments, and carefully managed relationships with law enforcement. Most importantly, it demands the ability to inspire loyalty in workers while keeping respect among equals. Delacroce teaches Gotti to think in terms of decades rather than days. Every decision must be looked at for its long-term results. Every relationship must be built with an understanding of how it might prove valuable years in the future. Every enemy must be stopped or converted, because in this small world of organized crime, today's rival might become tomorrow's most valuable friend. The relationship between teacher and student deepens when Gotti proves himself during a particularly challenging situation. A rival crew tries to move in on Gambino territory in Queens, threatening several of the family's most money-making operations. Rather than responding with quick violence, Gotti plans a complex operation that removes the threat while creating new business opportunities. He begins by identifying the rival crew's moneybackers and their sources of political protection. Then he slowly undermines, both using a combination of money pressure, targeted violence, and smart alliance building. The operation takes 6 months to complete, but when it is finished, the rival crew has not only pulled out of Queens, but has also provided the Gambino family with valuable information about their former partners. This success establishes Gotti as one of the most promising young members of the Gambino family. More importantly, it shows his ability to think like a boss rather than a soldier. Carlo Gambino himself takes notice, inviting the young man to several high-level meetings and slowly increasing his responsibilities within the organization. Gotti's personal life during this period reflects his growing success in the criminal world. In 1962, he marries Victoria DiGiorgio, a strong-willed woman who understands the nature of her husband's work but demands that family life remain separate from criminal activities. Victoria provides stability and normalcy that allows Gotti to separate his life well. The couple's first child, Angela, is born in 1963, followed by Victoria in 1964, John Jr. in 1966, Frank in 1967, and Peter in 1974. Gotti proves to be a loving father, insisting that his children receive the best education possible while protecting them from direct knowledge of his criminal activities. However, keeping this separation becomes harder as Gotti's reputation grows. By the late 1960s, he is running his own crew of soldiers and associates, controlling major territory in Queens and making big income for the Gambino family. His success brings more attention from law enforcement, creating constant tension between his desire for a normal family life and the demands of his criminal career. The period from 1970 to 1975 represents the height of Gotti's success as a capo. His crew becomes known throughout New York as one of the most skilled and money-making in any of the 5 families. They specialize in airport cargo theft, labor racketeering, and loan sharking, but they also begin to branch out into more advanced businesses like stock manipulation and legal business investments. Gotti's leadership style during this period establishes patterns that will define his entire career. He is generous with workers, sharing profits more fairly than most crime bosses. He is also strongly protective of his crew members, going to great lengths to secure their release when they are arrested and providing money support for their families during periods of jail time. This loyalty creates matching devotion from his soldiers. Men who work for Gotti know that he will never abandon them, never sacrifice them without reason, and never forget their service to the family. This creates an unusual degree of stability within his organization, allowing for long-term planning and advanced operations that require continued cooperation among multiple people. The death of Carlo Gambino in 1976 creates a power gap that completely changes the dynamics of the crime family. Rather than promoting Aniello Delacroce, who was widely expected to take over from the aging boss, Gambino names his brother-in-law Paul Castellano as the new head of the family. The decision creates quick tension within the organization. Delacroce commands the loyalty of the family's more traditional members, the men who specialize in street-level criminal activities and keep direct connections to the neighborhoods, where the Gambino family's power is most visible. Castellano, by contrast, represents a new generation of crime bosses who prefer advanced white-collar crimes and legal business investments. John Gotti finds himself caught between these competing visions of organized crime's future. His loyalty to Delacroce is complete, but his practical intelligence recognizes that Castellano's approach might be more money-making in the long term. This internal conflict shapes his actions throughout the late 1970s and early 1980s, as he tries to keep good relationships with both sides while positioning himself for moving up regardless of which way wins out in the end. Castellano's leadership style quickly creates problems for Gotti and other street-level operators. The new boss prefers to distance himself from traditional mob activities, focusing instead on construction industry corruption, labor union manipulation, and stock market fraud. He views drug dealing as too risky and street-level violence as harmful to the family's long-term interests. These preferences put Castellano at odds with many of his workers, who built their careers on exactly the kinds of activities he now discourages. Gotti, in particular, finds his most money-making operations threatened by the boss's new policies. His crew's airport theft operations make big income, but require occasional violence to keep their power. His loan sharking business depends on the real threat of physical harm to non-paying customers. The tension between Gotti and Castellano becomes personal when the boss begins to question the younger man's methods and judgment. Castellano criticizes Gotti's high profile in the media, his expensive lifestyle, and his habit of socializing publicly with known criminals. These criticisms reflect basic differences in their approaches to organized crime leadership. Castellano believes that successful crime bosses should be invisible, doing their business through go-betweens and keeping respectable appearances. Gotti, influenced by Delacroix's old-school way of thinking, believes that respect must be earned through visible shows of power, and that fear is a more reliable motivator than greed. The conflict gets worse when federal prosecutors begin targeting the Gambino family's construction industry operations. Castellano's high-profile involvement in legal businesses makes him open to RICO, prosecutions that can connect his legal and illegal activities. Several of his closest associates are charged, and wiretap evidence suggests that federal investigators have wide knowledge of the family's internal operations. Gotti begins to question Castellano's ability as a leader. He argues privately to Delacroix that the boss's mistakes are putting the entire organization at risk. More dangerously, he begins to suggest that Castellano's security practices are not good enough, and that federal investigators might be getting inside information about family activities. These concerns are not completely without reason. The FBI surveillance abilities have grown greatly during the 1970s, and federal prosecutors have developed increasingly smart strategies for taking apart organized crime organizations. The traditional rules that protected crime bosses, political corruption, witness scaring, and boundary limitations are proving less effective against coordinated federal investigations. Delacroix tries to mediate between his student and his boss, but the basic disagreement cannot be fixed through talking. Castellano represents the future of organized crime as he sees it: advanced, low profile, and focused on making the most profits while reducing risks. Gotti represents its past, territorial, violent, and dependent on reputation and fear for its power. The breaking point comes in 1984, when Castellano is charged on federal racketeering charges that could result in a life sentence if he is found guilty, rather than stepping down temporarily to fight the charges. Castellano continues to run the family from his mansion on Staten Island, talking with workers through go-betweens and electronic surveillance that federal investigators can watch. Gotti becomes convinced that Castellano's continued leadership poses a life-threatening danger to the Gambino family. He believes that the boss will either be found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, leaving the organization without good leadership, or will cooperate with federal prosecutors to reduce his sentence, destroying the family completely. More personally, Gotti fears that Castellano's legal problems will eventually swallow his own operations. Federal investigators are already showing interest in his crew's activities, and several of his associates have been questioned by FBI agents. If Castellano decides to cooperate with prosecutors, Gotti could find himself facing a life sentence based on his former boss's testimony. These practical concerns, combined with personal hate, convince Gotti that Castellano must be removed. However, the killing of a sitting crime boss breaks basic rules of organized crime control. Such an action requires approval from the heads of the other four families, and even with such approval, it could trigger a war that might destroy all of New York's crime organizations. Gotti begins to plan Castellano's murder with his usual thoroughness and attention to detail. He recognizes that the killing must be carried out in a way that shows his strength to possible rivals while reducing the risk of revenge from Castellano's supporters within the family. The plan that comes together reflects Gotti's smart intelligence and his understanding of organized crime psychology. Rather than simply killing Castellano, he will plan a public execution that establishes his control, while sending a clear message to anyone who might consider challenging his authority. The location chosen for the killing, Sparks Steakhouse in Midtown Manhattan, is perfect for Gotti's purposes. The restaurant is fancy enough to attract Castellano, who enjoys the finer things in life, but public enough to make sure that the murder receives maximum media attention. Most importantly, it is located in territory controlled by the Gambino family, showing that Gotti has enough support within the organization to challenge the sitting boss. The planning of Paul Castellano's killing represents John Gotti's masterpiece of criminal strategy. Every detail is figured out to achieve multiple goals: remove a rival, establish control, reduce revenge, and make the most psychological impact on both friends and enemies. Gotti's first challenge is putting together a team capable of doing such a high-profile murder. The killing of a crime boss requires people who are not only skilled and ruthless, but also completely trustworthy. Any member of the team could destroy the entire operation by revealing details to law enforcement or rival crime families. The core team consists of 4 shooters: John Carneglia, Charles Carneglia, Salvatore Scala, and Vincent Artuso. These men have worked with Gotti for years, proving their loyalty through many criminal businesses. More importantly, each has personal reasons for supporting Gotti's leadership over Castellano's, making sure that their commitment extends beyond just professional duty. The details of the operation require months of preparation. Gotti's crew does surveillance of Castellano's daily routines, finding patterns that can be used. They figure out that the boss meets regularly with his underboss, Thomas Bilotti, at various Manhattan restaurants, usually arriving and leaving in Castellano's easy-to-spot Lincoln Town car. Sparks Steakhouse comes up as the perfect location because Castellano has eaten there several times, establishing a pattern that can be predicted. More importantly, the restaurant's location on East 46th Street provides multiple escape routes while being far enough from traditional mob strongholds to avoid quick revenge from Castellano's supporters. The mind game aspects of the killing are as carefully planned as the action elements. Gotti chooses to position himself across the street from the restaurant, making his presence known to witnesses without directly taking part in the shooting. This establishes his authority over the operation while providing legal protection. If the gunmen are captured, the timing is also carefully picked. December 16, 1985 falls during the height of the Christmas shopping season, making sure that the streets are crowded with possible witnesses. This increases the risk of the operation, but also promises maximum media coverage, which serves Gotti's long-term political purposes within the Gambino family. On the evening of the killing, Gotti's crew takes their positions around Sparks Steakhouse at about 5:30 p.m. The shooters, dressed in similar dark overcoats and fur hats that will make identification difficult, position themselves near the restaurant's entrance. Gotti, along with Salvatore Gravano, positions himself across the street where he can observe the entire operation. At 5:26 p.m., Castellano's Lincoln Town car pulls up to the restaurant's entrance. The boss comes out from the passenger side, while Bilotti stays behind the wheel. As Castellano walks toward the restaurant's entrance, the 4 shooters approach from different angles, pulling their weapons at the same time. The killing happens with brutal speed. Castellano is hit by 6 bullets, falling right away to the sidewalk outside the restaurant. Bilotti, trying to help his boss, is shot down beside the Lincoln. The entire operation lasts less than 30 seconds, with the shooters disappearing into the crowded Manhattan streets before police or witnesses can react well. Gotti's presence across the street serves multiple purposes. His visibility establishes his authority over the killing, showing to members of the Gambino family that he has both the courage and the power to challenge the established order. His careful positioning also gives him direct observation of the operation, letting him make sure that the killing is completed successfully. The quick aftermath of the murders reveals how well Gotti's planning worked. Police arrive within minutes, but the shooters have already vanished into the Manhattan crowds. Witnesses give conflicting descriptions of the gunmen, and physical evidence from the crime scene gives few clues about who they are. More importantly, the killing achieves its primary political goal within the Gambino family. Castellano's death creates a quick power gap, and Gotti's visible presence at the scene establishes his claim to leadership. Family members who might have supported other candidates for boss are forced to accept that Gotti has both the ruthlessness and the organizational ability to remove rivals. The media reaction to the Sparks Steakhouse murders goes beyond even Gotti's expectations. The killing of a major crime boss in Midtown Manhattan makes headlines across the country, establishing Gotti as a national figure even before he is officially recognized as the new head of the Gambino family. However, the success of the killing also creates new challenges for Gotti. Federal investigators right away focus on the murders as possible RICO violations, understanding that proving Gotti's involvement could result in life sentences for multiple people. The FBI begins intensive surveillance of Gotti and his associates, making future criminal activities much more difficult. Within the Gambino family, Castellano's death creates mixed reactions. Many members welcome Gotti's aggressive leadership style and his commitment to traditional organized crime activities. Others worry that his high-profile and confrontational approach will attract unwanted law enforcement attention that could destroy the entire organization. The other four families respond carefully to the killing. While none of them tries to avenge Castellano's death, they also make it clear that Gotti's leadership of the Gambino family is temporary, pending his ability to show effective control over the organization. John Gotti's change from ambitious capo to recognized crime boss requires more than the successful removal of Paul Castellano. The months following the Sparks Steakhouse murders test every aspect of his leadership abilities as he works to build power within the Gambino family while avoiding the legal results of his actions. The first challenge comes from within the family itself. Several of Castellano's supporters question Gotti's authority, arguing that the killing broke traditional rules governing who takes over within organized crime families. These critics say that Gotti should have asked for approval from the other four families before acting against a sitting boss, and that his failure to do so threatens the stability of New York's entire criminal world. Gotti responds to this internal opposition with a combination of smart generosity and calculated scaring. He promotes several of Castellano's former friends to positions of authority within his administration, showing that he values their experience while making it clear that continued opposition could be dangerous. At the same time, Gotti reorganizes the family's territorial divisions to reward his most loyal supporters with increased responsibilities and larger shares of criminal money. This creates powerful reasons for family members to support his leadership while making possible rivals dependent on his continued success. The process of establishing real authority within the Gambino family requires Gotti to master skills that were less important during his career as a capo. As boss, he must settle disputes between workers, give out resources among competing criminal businesses, and keep relationships with leaders of other crime families. Most challenging of all, he must balance the traditional aspects of organized crime, leadership with the practical requirements of managing a large criminal organization in the modern time. This means keeping the respect and fear that keeps workers loyal while developing the political connections and legal business relationships that protect the family from law enforcement pressure. Gotti's approach to these challenges reflects his personality and his understanding of what made previous crime bosses successful. Unlike Castellano, who preferred to operate from behind the scenes, Gotti keeps a highly visible public profile. He dresses expensively, dines at the finest restaurants, and makes no attempt to hide his wealthy lifestyle. This visibility serves several smart purposes. Within the criminal world, it shows Gotti's confidence and power, suggesting that he is well connected enough to operate openly without fear of arrest. Among possible rivals, it establishes his control through obvious displays of wealth and influence. However, Gotti's high profile also attracts unusual media attention that makes his efforts to build power harder. Newspaper reporters and television journalists begin following his activities, turning routine criminal proceedings into public shows that create additional law enforcement pressure. The media attention creates what becomes known as the Gotti phenomenon, a level of public interest in a crime boss that has no match in American organized crime history. Reporters compete to publish details about his personal life, his fashion choices, and his social activities, creating a celebrity status that both helps and threatens his criminal authority. Gotti's response to this media attention reveals his smart understanding of public relations and political psychology. Rather than avoiding reporters or trying to reduce coverage, he begins to build relationships with selected journalists, giving them carefully controlled access in exchange for good coverage. This strategy changes Gotti from a criminal defendant into a folk hero among certain parts of the public. His expensive suits, his confident behavior in court, and his apparent ability to defeat federal prosecutors create an image of success that connects with people who view him as someone who has beaten a system they see as corrupt or unfair. The building of this public image becomes central to Gotti's strategy for keeping power within the Gambino family. By positioning himself as a successful and respected leader in the broader community, he strengthens his authority among workers who benefit from their connection with such a well-known figure. However, the media attention also creates serious operational challenges. FBI surveillance of Gotti and his associates gets much stronger, making routine criminal activities much more difficult. Federal prosecutors begin developing RICO cases that focus specifically on Gotti's role as the head of the Gambino family. Understanding that his high profile makes him an attractive target for major prosecutions. During this period, Gotti's family life becomes more and more complex. His wife Victoria struggles with the constant media attention and the obvious dangers connected with her husband's criminal activities. His children, now teenagers and young adults, must deal with the social problems created by their father's fame. Gotti tries to protect his family from the negative results of his criminal career while keeping the close relationships that provide him with emotional stability and motivation. He insists that family gatherings remain private affairs, protected from both media coverage and law enforcement surveillance. At the same time, he begins to involve some family members more directly in his criminal activities. His son, John Jr., shows interest in following his father's path, leading to tensions with Victoria, who fears that the next generation will be destroyed by the same forces that threaten her husband. The period from 1987 to 1989 represents the height of Gotti's success as a crime boss. The Gambino family under his leadership becomes the most powerful organized crime organization in America, making hundreds of millions of dollars every year through a diverse mix of criminal businesses. Gotti's crew controls major portions of New York's construction industry, controlling labor unions and threatening contractors on major building projects throughout the area. They operate wide gambling networks, manage advanced loan sharking operations, and keep trafficking relationships and import narcotics, stolen goods, and other illegal items from around the world. More importantly, Gotti develops the political connections and legal business, relationships that previous generations of crime bosses used to protect their organizations from law enforcement pressure. He builds relationships with judges, prosecutors, police officials, and politicians, creating a network of corruption that makes successful prosecutions very difficult. The nickname Teflon Don comes from John, Gotti's amazing ability to avoid being found guilty despite being prosecuted multiple times during the late 1980s. This period represents the top of his power and influence, as he defeats federal prosecutors in a series of high-profile trials that establish him as the most famous crime boss in American history. Gotti's first major trial as head of the Gambino family begins in August 1986, just 8 months after the Sparks Steakhouse murders. Federal prosecutors charge him with racketeering, conspiracy, and multiple counts of murder, including the killing of Paul Castellano. The case represents the government's most ambitious attempt to use RICO laws against organized crime, and its outcome will determine the future of federal prosecutions against crime bosses. The prosecution's case relies heavily on wiretap evidence, witness testimony, and circumstantial evidence linking Gotti to various criminal activities. However, the defense team led by Bruce Cutler develops a strategy that challenges not only the specific evidence, but also the basic assumptions underlying the government's case. Cutler argues that Gotti is being prosecuted not for specific criminal acts, but for his lifestyle, his associations, and his public image. The defense says that the federal government is using RICO laws to make behavior criminal that, while perhaps morally questionable, does not break specific laws. More effectively, the defense challenges the believability of government witnesses, many of whom are admitted criminals looking for reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Cutler shows that these witnesses have strong reasons to lie, and that their testimony is contradicted by physical evidence and other witness statements. The trial becomes a media sensation that changes Gotti into a national celebrity. His daily appearances at federal court in Manhattan draw crowds of supporters and curious people, while television cameras broadcast his confident behavior and expensive clothing to audiences across the country. Gotti's behavior during the trial shows his smart understanding of public relations and legal strategy. He arrives each day perfectly dressed, keeps perfect calm under cross-examination, and projects an image of dignity and respectability that contradicts the prosecution's portrayal of him as a violent criminal. The jury's verdict, delivered in March 1987, shocks federal prosecutors and establishes Gotti's reputation for being unbeatable. He is found not guilty on all charges, with several jurors later stating that they found the government's witnesses unconvincing and its evidence not enough to prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The not guilty verdict creates huge media coverage that further improves Gotti's public profile. Newspaper headlines call him the Teflon Don, suggesting that criminal charges cannot stick to him regardless of the evidence presented. Television reporters compete to interview him, creating a level of celebrity status never seen before for an organized crime figure. However, the trial's outcome also makes federal law enforcement efforts to build cases against Gotti and the Gambino family stronger. The FBI greatly expands its surveillance operations, understanding that traditional investigative methods are not enough to break into Gotti's organization effectively. The second major prosecution comes in 1988 when federal prosecutors charge Gotti with assault and conspiracy in connection with the shooting of John O'Connor, a carpenters union official who had criticized Gambino family influence in the construction industry. The case represents a different legal strategy, focusing on a specific incident rather than trying to prove a broad pattern of criminal activity. Once again, Gotti's defense team successfully challenges the government's evidence and witness testimony. The prosecution's case relies primarily on the testimony of James McBretney, a former Gambino associate who claims that Gotti ordered the O'Connor shooting during a meeting at a Queens restaurant. The defense shows that McBretney is an unreliable witness with a history of mental illness and drug abuse. More importantly, they present evidence suggesting that McBretney was not present at the meeting where he claims Gotti issued the order, undermining the foundation of the prosecution's case. The trial results in another not guilty verdict for Gotti, further cementing his reputation as someone who cannot be found guilty regardless of the charges brought against him. The media coverage of this second victory establishes him as a figure who has successfully challenged the federal justice system and come out winning. The string of not guilty verdicts creates a story around Gotti that extends far beyond the criminal world. He becomes a symbol of success and defiance for people who view him as someone who has beaten a system they see as corrupt or unfair. This celebrity status brings benefits, but also creates new problems. The positive aspects of Gotti's fame include better authority within the Gambino family and increased respect from other crime organizations. His ability to defeat federal prosecutors shows to workers and rivals that he has both the intelligence and the resources necessary for successful criminal leadership. More practically, his celebrity status creates chances for legal business investments and political relationships that can protect the family from future law enforcement pressure. Politicians and business leaders who might normally avoid connection with known criminals are willing to deal with someone who has achieved such fame and apparent respectability. However, the fame also creates problems that finally contribute to Gotti's downfall. The constant media attention makes it much more difficult for him to do routine criminal activities without detection. FBI surveillance gets stronger to the point where agents watch his daily movements, his social activities, and his business meetings. More dangerously, Gotti's celebrity status creates anger among some members of the Gambino family who believe that his high profile puts the entire organization at unnecessary risk. Traditional organized crime thinking emphasizes being invisible and low-profile operations. Gotti's approach represents a basic departure from these principles. The tension between Gotti's public image and the operational requirements of organized crime leadership becomes more and more apparent during the late 1980s. While he continues to defeat federal prosecutors in court, the constant surveillance and media attention make it much more difficult for him to manage the family's criminal business as well. Federal investigators, frustrated by their inability to find Gotti guilty in court, begin developing new strategies that focus on his closest associates and the organizational structure of the Gambino family, rather than trying to prove specific criminal acts. They concentrate on documenting the ongoing criminal business and Gotti's role as its leader. This shift in prosecution strategy happens at the same time as technology advances that make electronic surveillance much more effective. The FBI develops new abilities for watching conversations in locations that previously provided security for organized crime leaders, including private offices, restaurants, and social clubs. The combination of better surveillance technology and improved prosecution strategies creates conditions that will eventually lead to Gotti's downfall. However, during the peak years of 1987 to 1990, he appears to be untouchable, successfully keeping his position as America's most powerful and famous crime boss. The beginning of John Gotti's downfall can be traced to December 11, 1990, when FBI agents arrest him on federal racketeering charges that prosecutors believe will finally bring down the Teflon Don. This arrest, unlike his previous meetings with federal law enforcement, is the result of a 4-year investigation that has gotten deeper into the Gambino family's operations than any previous effort. The key to this investigation is the FBI's successful installation of listening devices in the Ravenite Social Club, Gotti's headquarters in Little Italy. For years, the club served as the control center of Gambino family operations, where Gotti met with his closest associates to plan criminal activities, solve disputes, and manage the organization's vast criminal empire. The surveillance of the Ravenite represents a technology breakthrough in federal law enforcement's battle against organized crime. Previous attempts to watch Gotti's conversations had been stopped by his smart counter-surveillance techniques and his habit of having sensitive discussions while walking outside or in public, places where recording devices could not work well. However, the FBI's 1989 installation of bugs in the club's upstairs apartment creates an unusual chance to record Gotti's private conversations with his most trusted advisors. Over the course of nearly 2 years, federal investigators build up hundreds of hours of recordings that document the inner workings of the Gambino family in amazing detail. The most damaging recordings feature conversations between Gotti and his underboss, Salvatore Sammy the Bull Gravano. These tapes reveal not only specific criminal activities, but also Gotti's leadership style, his decision-making processes, and his attitudes toward violence, loyalty, and organizational discipline. In one particularly damaging conversation, Gotti discusses the murder of Robert DiBernardo, a Gambino family member who had fallen out of favor with the boss. The recording captures Gotti explaining his decision to order DiBernardo's execution, giving federal prosecutors direct evidence of his involvement in murder. More broadly, the Ravenik recordings document Gotti's role as the leader of an ongoing criminal business, exactly the kind of evidence required for successful RICO prosecutions. The tapes show him making decisions about territory disputes, approving criminal operations, and disciplining workers who break family rules. However, the most important development in the federal case against Gotti comes not from electronic surveillance, but from an unexpected source: Salvatore Gravano's decision to cooperate with federal prosecutors. This betrayal by his closest associate represents the most damaging blow to Gotti's organization and his personal position. Gravano's cooperation results from a combination of factors that show the psychological pressures facing high-ranking organized crime figures in the modern time. The underboss faces life imprisonment if found guilty on the charges coming from the Ravenite surveillance. At age 47, he must choose between spending the rest of his life in federal prison or betraying the organization that has defined his entire adult identity. The decision becomes easier when Gravano learns about Gotti's private criticisms of his performance and loyalty, recorded during conversations at the Ravenite. These tapes reveal that Gotti has questioned Gravano's judgment, criticized his business decisions, and suggested that the underboss might be cooperating with federal investigators. For Gravano, who has risked his life repeatedly in service to Gotti and the Gambino family, these criticisms represent an unforgivable betrayal. The traditional code of organized crime demands complete loyalty between boss and underboss. Gotti's willingness to criticize his deputy privately while keeping a front of support publicly breaks this basic principle. Gravano's cooperation provides federal prosecutors with the most valuable witness in the history of organized crime prosecutions. As underboss of the Gambino family, he has direct knowledge of the organization's most sensitive activities. More importantly, his believability as a witness is helped by his obvious unwillingness to betray his former associates and his detailed knowledge of events that can be proven through other evidence. The underboss's decision to cooperate creates a series of additional prosecution opportunities. His testimony connects dozens of Gambino family members in serious criminal activities, creating pressure for additional cooperation from lower-ranking figures who fear lengthy prison sentences. More right away, Gravano's cooperation provides prosecutors with insider knowledge of Gotti's personal involvement in multiple murders, including the killing of Paul Castellano. For the first time, federal investigators have a witness who can testify from direct, personal knowledge about Gotti's role in planning and carrying out the most important organized crime murder in recent American history. The psychological impact of Gravano's betrayal on Gotti cannot be overstated. The two men have worked together for over 15 years, sharing risks, profits, and the close knowledge that comes from mutual dependence in dangerous circumstances. Gravano's cooperation represents not just a tactical setback, but a basic challenge to Gotti's understanding of loyalty, honor, and the bonds that hold organized crime families together. Gotti's first response to news of Gravano's cooperation is disbelief followed by rage. He cannot accept that someone he trusted so completely would break the most sacred principles of organized crime culture. This emotional reaction interferes with his ability to develop effective legal strategies for dealing with Gravano's testimony. The federal charges resulting from the Ravenite surveillance and Gravano's cooperation represents the most complete RICO case ever brought against a sitting crime boss. The charges include murder, racketeering, obstruction of justice, tax evasion, and conspiracy, with possible sentences that could result in life imprisonment without possibility of parole. More importantly, the quality of evidence available to prosecutors makes this case completely different from Gotti's previous trials. Rather than relying primarily on the testimony of criminal associates looking for sentence reductions, the government has electronic surveillance that documents Gotti's own words and the supporting testimony of his former underboss. The charges also charge other high-ranking Gambino family members, creating additional pressure for cooperation from defendants who might provide testimony against Gotti. Federal prosecutors understand that organized crime prosecutions are most effective when they create momentum that encourages multiple witnesses to come forward. As Gotti prepares for what he understands will be the most important trial of his life, he faces challenges that his previous legal victories have not prepared him to handle. The evidence against him is stronger, the witness testimony more believable, and the federal prosecutors more experienced in dealing with his defensive strategies. Perhaps most importantly, the media attention that previously worked in his favor now creates additional pressure for his conviction. Public interest in the Teflon Don has created expectations that federal law enforcement will finally succeed in bringing him to justice, creating political reasons for prosecutors to pursue the case aggressively. The trial of John Gotti begins on February 12, 1992, in federal court in Brooklyn, under the supervision of Judge Leo Glasser. From the opening day, it becomes clear that this proceeding will be unlike any previous organized crime trial in American history, both in terms of the evidence presented and the public attention it creates. The prosecution team, led by John Gleason and Andrew Maloney, presents a case built around three pillars of evidence: the Ravenite surveillance tapes, Salvatore Gravano's testimony, and supporting evidence from other witnesses and law enforcement sources. This combination creates a complete picture of Gotti's criminal activities that prosecutors believe will finally overcome his reputation for being unbeatable. The government's opening argument focuses on establishing Gotti's role as the leader of a violent criminal business responsible for many murders, wide racketeering activities, and planned corruption of legal businesses and government institutions. Prosecutors argue that the evidence will show Gotti not as a folk hero or celebrity, but as a ruthless criminal who has caused unmeasurable harm to his community and his victims. The first phase of the prosecution case involves playing selected portions of the Ravenite surveillance tapes for the jury. These recordings provide unusual insight into Gotti's leadership style, his decision-making processes, and his attitude toward violence as a tool of organizational control. In one particularly damaging recording, Gotti discusses his way of thinking about leadership with Gravano and other associates. He explains that respect in organized crime must be earned through shown willingness to use violence, and that workers who show weakness or disloyalty must be removed to keep organizational discipline. The tapes also document specific criminal activities, including discussions of murder, extortion, and racketeering operations. Most importantly, they capture Gotti's own words, describing his involvement in ordering the execution of several Gambino family members who had broken organizational rules or threatened his authority. However, the most compelling evidence comes from Salvatore Gravano's testimony. which begins on March 2, 1992, and continues for 9 days. Gravano's appearance in federal court represents a watershed moment in organized crime history. Never before has an underboss of a major crime family testified against his former boss in such detail. Gravano's testimony carefully describes the structure and operations of the Gambino family under Gotti's leadership. He explains the order of authority, the methods used to make income, and the codes of conduct that control relationships between family members. This background information provides context for his more specific testimony about criminal activities. The underboss testifies about his personal involvement in 19 murders, including several that were ordered directly by Gotti. His descriptions of these killings are detailed and emotionally affecting, giving the jury with graphic evidence of the violence that underlies organized crime operations. Most damaging to Gotti's case is Gravano's testimony about the killing of Paul Castellano. The underboss describes the planning process, Gotti's role in organizing the murder, and the quick aftermath of the shooting outside Sparks Steakhouse. His account provides the first insider perspective on one of the most important organized crime murders in American history. Gravano also testifies about Gotti's involvement in other murders, including the killings of Robert DeBernardo, Louis Melito, and Louis De Bono. In each case, he describes Gotti's decision-making process, his instructions to workers, and his reactions to the completed killings. The defense strategy developed by Bruce Cutler and his team focuses on attacking Gravano's believability as a witness. They argue that the underboss is lying to get a reduced sentence and that his testimony is contradicted by other evidence and witness statements. Cutler's cross-examination of Gravano is intense and long, designed to expose inconsistencies in his testimony and show his motivation to lie. The defense argues that Gravano is a professional criminal who has made a career of lying and cannot be trusted to tell the truth even under oath. The defense also tries to portray Gotti as a legal businessman who has been targeted by federal prosecutors because of his high profile and his success in previous trials. They argue that the government's case is based on guilt by association rather than evidence of specific criminal acts. However, the defense strategy faces big obstacles that did not exist in Gotti's previous trials. The electronic surveillance evidence is difficult to challenge because it captures Gotti's own words rather than relying on witness testimony. The supporting evidence from multiple sources makes it difficult to argue that the prosecution case is based only on unreliable witness testimony. Most importantly, Gravano's testimony is supported by detailed knowledge of events that can be checked through other sources. His descriptions of meetings, conversations, and criminal activities are consistent with surveillance reports, physical evidence, and testimony from other witnesses. The trial creates amazing media coverage that changes the federal courthouse in Brooklyn into the center of a media circus. Television crews, newspaper reporters, and photographers compete for access to participants and witnesses, creating a carnival atmosphere that sometimes overshadows the serious criminal charges being considered. Gotti's daily appearances at court continue to create crowds of supporters and curious people, but the atmosphere is clearly different from his previous trials. The strength of the government's evidence and the seriousness of the charges create a sense that this trial represents Gotti's final opportunity to avoid life imprisonment. The prosecution's case concludes after 6 weeks of testimony and evidence presentation. Federal prosecutors express confidence that they have finally put together evidence enough to find the Teflon Don guilty, ending his decade-long string of legal victories. The defense case is much shorter, focusing mainly on character witnesses who testify about Gotti's positive contributions to his community and his reputation as a devoted family man. However, the defense is limited in its options by the strength of the government's evidence and the difficulty of challenging surveillance recordings and insider testimony. Closing arguments begin on April 1, 1992, with prosecutors summarizing the evidence and arguing that it establishes Gotti's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. They say that the combination of surveillance evidence, insider testimony, and supporting sources provides a complete picture of Gotti's criminal activities that cannot be explained away by defensive arguments about witness believability or prosecution bias. The defense's closing argument focuses on attacking Gravano's believability and arguing that the government has failed to prove specific criminal acts beyond a reasonable doubt. However, the defense faces the difficult task of explaining away surveillance recordings that capture Gotti's own words describing criminal activities. The jury begins thinking on April 2, 1992, after receiving instructions from Judge Glasser about the legal standards for conviction under RICO laws. The thinking process takes less than 14 hours, suggesting the jurors found the government's evidence compelling and the defense arguments unconvincing. On April 2, 1992, the jury delivers its verdict, guilty on all counts. John Gotti, a man who had beaten federal prosecutors in multiple previous trials, finally faces the legal results of his criminal career. The conviction represents not just a personal defeat, but the end of a time in American organized crime. Judge I Leo Glasser sentences Gotti to life imprisonment without possibility of parole, plus $250,000 in fines. The sentence reflects both the seriousness of his crimes and the court's determination to make sure that he will never again pose a threat to public safety. At age 51, Gotti must face the reality that he will spend the remainder of his life in federal prison. The quick aftermath of the conviction creates mixed reactions within the Gambino family and the broader organized crime community. Some family members express shock and dismay at the loss of their leader, while others privately accept that Gotti's high-profile and confrontational approach had made his downfall bound to happen. More practically, the conviction creates a quick succession crisis within the Gambino family. Federal prosecutors have charged or found guilty most of Gotti's top lieutenants, leaving the organization without experienced leadership at exactly the moment when it faces its greatest challenges. Gotti's first assignment to the federal prison system takes him to the United States Penitentiary at Marion, Illinois, one of the most secure facilities in the federal system. Marion houses the most dangerous and high-profile federal inmates, including terrorists, spies, and other organized crime leaders. The transition from crime boss to federal prisoner represents a basic shock to Gotti's identity and self-image. For over 30 years, he has been used to respect, luxury, and the power to make life and death decisions affecting hundreds of people. Prison life strips away all of these privileges, reducing him to the status of any other convicted felon. However, Gotti's celebrity status makes sure that his imprisonment receives amazing media attention. Newspaper reporters and television journalists compete to publish details about his prison routine, his interactions with other inmates, and his efforts to keep contact with family members and former associates. This media attention serves both positive and negative functions for Gotti. On one hand, it keeps his public profile and reinforces his status as an important figure in American culture. On the other hand, it attracts additional law enforcement, watching that makes it difficult for him to communicate with former associates or influence Gambino family operations. Federal prison officials put in place special security measures designed to prevent Gotti from directing criminal activities from his cell. His communications are watched, his visitors are limited, and his movements within the prison are carefully controlled. These measures reflect official recognition that Gotti's conviction has not necessarily ended his influence over organized crime. Despite these limits, Gotti tries to keep some degree of control over Gambino family operations through carefully managed communications with his son John Jr. and other trusted associates. However, these efforts are hurt by federal surveillance and by the practical difficulties of managing a complex criminal organization from prison. The leadership crisis within the Gambino family gets worse as federal prosecutors continue to target high-ranking members with RICO prosecutions. The combination of Gotti's imprisonment and continued law enforcement pressure creates conditions that completely change the organization's structure and operations. John Gotti Jr. comes up as his father's named successor, but his leadership faces quick challenges from federal prosecutors and competing groups within the family. The younger Gotti lacks his father's charm and street believability, making it difficult for him to keep discipline and loyalty among family members. More broadly, the conviction represents a victory for federal law enforcement strategies that have evolved over decades to fight organized crime more effectively. The successful use of RICO laws, electronic surveillance, and cooperating witnesses establishes a template that prosecutors will use against other crime families throughout the 1990s. Psychological impact of imprisonment on Gotti becomes clear through his interactions with family members and his behavior within the prison system. Friends and relatives describe a man who struggles to accept the reality of his situation while keeping the front of strength and defiance that defined his public image. Gotti's relationship with his wife Victoria becomes more and more strained as the years pass. The practical difficulties of keeping a marriage while one partner is imprisoned for life create emotional and money pressures that test even the strongest relationships. Victoria must cope with raising their youngest children while dealing with the stigma and ongoing legal problems connected with her husband's criminal career. The conviction also affects Gotti's relationships with his adult children in complex ways. Some family members distance themselves from their criminal heritage, trying to build legal careers and normal family lives. Others, particularly John Jr., become more deeply involved in organized crime activities, creating additional law enforcement targets and family conflicts. During his first decade in prison, Gotti keeps his physical fitness and mental sharpness through disciplined daily routines. He reads a lot, particularly biographies of historical figures and books about organized crime history. He also develops friendships with other high-profile inmates, creating a social network that provides emotional support and intellectual stimulation. However, the stress of imprisonment and the loss of his former lifestyle begin to take their toll on Gotti's health. By the late 1990s, he begins to experience medical problems that will eventually prove fatal. These health issues create additional problems for prison officials, who must balance security concerns with medical care requirements. Gotti's legal appeals proceed through the federal court system without success. His lawyers argue that the conviction was based on illegally obtained evidence and unreliable witness testimony, but appeals courts consistently reject these arguments. The strength of the original prosecution case makes it virtually impossible to overturn the conviction on procedural grounds. The failure of legal appeals forces Gotti to face the reality that he will indeed spend the rest of his life in federal prison. This recognition leads to periods of depression and anger. That contrasts sharply with his public image of being unbeatable and defiant. As the new millennium approaches, Gotti's influence over Gambino family operations continues to shrink. The combination of his physical absence, continued federal prosecutions of family members, and changing conditions in organized crime reduces his organization to a shadow of its former power. The decline of the Gambino family under these circumstances shows the broader change of American organized crime during the 1990s and early 2000s. Federal law enforcement strategies that proved successful against Gotti are applied carefully against other crime families, creating a wave of convictions that completely changes the landscape of organized crime. However, Gotti's imprisonment also solidifies his status as a legendary figure in organized crime history. His rise from street-level criminal to crime boss, his string of legal victories during the 1980s, and his final downfall create a narrative that captures public imagination and makes sure his place in American criminal folklore. Media portrayals of Gotti during his imprisonment tend to focus on his continued defiance and his apparent unwillingness to show regret for his crimes. These characteristics reinforce his reputation as someone who remains committed to organized crime principles even in the face of life imprisonment. The last years of John Gotti's life happened against a background of declining health, family trouble, and the gradual breaking apart of the criminal empire he spent decades building. By 2000, cancer has begun its relentless attack on his body, while federal prosecutors continue their planned taking apart of the Gambino family structure he once commanded. Gotti's diagnosis with throat cancer in 1998 marks the beginning of his final battle, one that cannot be won through violence, scaring, or legal maneuvering. The disease progresses steadily despite medical treatment, creating physical limitations that slowly strip away the energy and commanding presence that defined his criminal career. The irony of his illness is not lost on those who knew him best. A man who built his reputation on his ability to talk his way out of any situation, to command respect through the power of his voice and personality, now faces an enemy that attacks his ability to speak, to communicate, to project the authority that made him the most feared crime boss in America. Prison medical facilities provide treatment that extends his life but cannot cure the underlying disease. The contrast between his current circumstances and his former lifestyle becomes more pronounced as his health gets worse. The man who once dined at the finest restaurants in New York now struggles to swallow prison food. The crime boss who wore $1,000 suits now spends his days in prison clothing. However, even facing terminal illness, Gotti keeps the psychological patterns that defined his approach to life. He refuses to show weakness to other inmates, continues to project confidence and authority despite his obvious physical decline, and keeps his complete refusal to cooperate with federal prosecutors or show regret for his crimes. This stubborn defiance extends to his relationship with his family, creating additional emotional problems during his final years. Family members who visit him describe a man who insists on discussing family business and keeping his role as patriarch despite being physically unable to fulfill those responsibilities. The situation becomes more complex as John Gotti Jr. faces his own legal challenges. Federal prosecutors charged the younger Gotti on racketeering charges in 1999, creating a new generation of legal battles that echo his father's earlier struggles with law enforcement. The parallels between father and son create additional media attention that keeps the Gotti name in headlines even as the original crime boss battles terminal illness. Gotti Sr.'s response to his son's legal troubles reveals the complexity of his character and the internal contradictions that defined his life. He expresses pride in his son's loyalty to family traditions, while at the same time recognizing that this loyalty may destroy the younger man's life, just as it finally destroyed his own. The elder Gotti's attempts to influence his son's legal strategy from prison show both his continued commitment to organized crime principles and his growing understanding of their final futility. He encourages resistance to federal prosecutors, while privately accepting that such resistance will likely result in life imprisonment for another generation of his family. These family dynamics create additional stress that makes Gotti's medical treatment and emotional stability harder. The man who always insisted on controlling every aspect of his environment now faces situations where his influence is minimal and his ability to protect those he loves is virtually non-existent. The media attention surrounding Gotti's illness creates public discussion about appropriate medical care for imprisoned criminals. Some commentators argue that his criminal activities make him unworthy of expensive medical treatment, while others say that basic human rights require adequate health care regardless of past actions. Federal prison officials navigate these competing pressures while trying to provide appropriate medical care within security limits. The challenge becomes more complex as Gotti's condition gets worse, and he requires more advanced treatments that are difficult to provide in a prison environment. During his final months, Gotti's physical condition forces him to face mortality in ways that his criminal career never demanded. A man who sent others to their deaths, who built his reputation on his willingness to use violence, now faces an enemy that cannot be scared, bribed, or removed through traditional organized crime methods. His interactions with family members during this period reveal aspects of his personality that were rarely visible during his criminal career. Visitors describe moments of weakness and regret that contrast sharply with his public image of unrepentant defiance. However, even these private moments are colored by his continued loyalty to organized crime principles and his refusal to publicly accept the harm caused by his actions. The question of last rites and religious reconciliation becomes particularly complex given Gotti's lifelong relationship with the Catholic Church. Despite his criminal activities, he kept nominal religious connections and insisted that family events include traditional Catholic ceremonies. However, his refusal to express genuine regret for his crimes creates theological problems that reflect broader tensions between religious doctrine and organized crime culture. As death approaches, Gotti's thoughts appear to focus more and more on his legacy and the impact of his life on his family and community. Associates who visited him during his final months described conversations that revealed his awareness that his criminal career had caused unmeasurable harm while failing to provide lasting benefits even to those closest to him. The gradual loss of his ability to speak effectively represents a particularly cruel irony for someone whose verbal skills had been central to his success. The man who could charm juries, scare rivals, and inspire loyalty in workers through the power of his personality now struggles to communicate basic needs to medical staff and family members. John Gotti dies on June 10, 2002, at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He is 61 years old and has served exactly 10 years of his life sentence. The official cause of death is throat cancer, but the deeper cause is the cumulative effect of a lifetime spent in pursuit of power, respect, and wealth through criminal activities. News of his death creates international media coverage that reflects the complex legacy of his life. Obituaries describe him at the same time as a ruthless criminal who caused unmeasurable harm to his community, and as a charming figure who captured public imagination through his defiance of authority and his apparent unbeatable nature during the height of his power. The quick reaction to his death reveals the continuing divisions in public opinion about his importance. Some commentators celebrate the end of a criminal career that terrorized legal businesses and corrupted government institutions. Others express admiration for his loyalty to family and friends, and his refusal to cooperate with law enforcement, even when facing life imprisonment. John Gotti's death marks more than the end of an individual criminal career. It represents the end of a time in American organized crime that began with the great Italian immigration of the early 20th century and reached its peak during the middle decades of that century. His life story summarizes the rise, triumph, and final decline of traditional organized crime in America. The change of organized crime that Gotti both embodied and resisted reflects broader changes in American society during the late 20th century. The ethnic neighborhoods that nurtured traditional crime families were spread out by urban renewal, economic mobility, and changing immigration patterns. The political corruption that protected earlier generations of crime bosses became more difficult to keep as government. Institutions became more professional and accountable. Most importantly, federal law enforcement developed the tools and strategies necessary to break into and take apart organized crime organizations. The RICO Act, electronic surveillance technology, and witness protection programs created conditions that made traditional organized crime operations more and more open to prosecution. Gotti's response to these changing conditions shows both his strengths and his limitations as a criminal leader. His charm, intelligence, and organizational skills enabled him to build the most powerful crime family in America during the 1980s. However, his high-profile lifestyle and confrontational approach to law enforcement finally made him a target that federal prosecutors could not ignore. The contrast between Gotti's approach and that of his predecessor Paul Castellano reflects competing ways of thinking about organized crime's future in modern America. Castellano believed that successful crime families must evolve toward advanced white-collar operations, done by leaders who keep respectable public appearances. Gotti represented the traditional model of visible neighborhood leaders, who commanded respect through shown willingness to use violence. Gotti's temporary success in using his traditional approach created widespread imitation among younger organized crime figures, who viewed his celebrity status and legal victories as evidence that old-school methods remained effective. However, his final downfall showed the basic weakness of such approaches to modern law enforcement techniques. The media attention that made Gotti famous also contributed to public interest in organized crime that extended far beyond the criminal community. His trials were broadcast live on television, his fashion choices were covered in newspapers, and his family life became the subject of intense public watching. This celebrity status changed him from a criminal defendant into a cultural phenomenon. However, the same media attention that improved Gotti's reputation within organized crime also provided federal law enforcement with powerful reasons to pursue his prosecution aggressively. His high profile made his continued freedom an embarrassment to federal prosecutors, creating political pressure for successful prosecutions that might not have existed for less famous criminals. The long-term impact of Gotti's career on organized crime extends beyond the quick effects of his prosecution and imprisonment. His methods of operation, his leadership style, and his final defeat provided both positive and negative lessons for later generations of criminal leaders. On one hand, Gotti's success during the 1980s showed the continued ability to work of traditional organized crime operations when done by skilled and charming leaders. His ability to make huge profits, keep organizational discipline, and resist law enforcement pressure inspired imitators throughout the criminal world. On the other hand, his eventual downfall showed the final futility of high-profile criminal careers in the modern time. The combination of better law enforcement abilities, electronic surveillance, and witness cooperation programs created conditions that made long-term success virtually impossible for leaders who attracted major attention. The evolution of organized crime since Gotti's imprisonment reflects the lessons learned from his career. Contemporary criminal organizations tend to be smaller, more specialized, and less hierarchical than traditional crime families. They avoid the territorial disputes, public violence, and media attention that characterized earlier times of organized crime. More importantly, modern organized crime leaders understand that success requires keeping low profiles and avoiding the kind of celebrity status that finally destroyed Gotti. Traditional model of the neighborhood crime boss, who commands public respect through visible displays of power, has largely disappeared from American cities. However, Gotti's influence on popular culture makes sure that his version of organized crime leadership continues to shape public perceptions of criminal organizations. Movies, television shows, and books about organized crime often draw inspiration from his career, keeping alive stereotypes and expectations that may have little resemblance to contemporary criminal activities. The academic study of organized crime has also been influenced by the wide documentation of Gotti's career. The surveillance recordings, witness testimony, and court records created by his prosecutions provide unusual insight into the internal workings of a major criminal organization. Researchers studying organized crime structure, decision-making processes, and cultural values have used materials from Gotti's cases to develop theories about criminal organization, behavior that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of his career. These studies contribute to broader understanding of how illegal organizations develop, keep themselves going, and finally decline. Law enforcement agencies continue to use strategies developed during the investigation and prosecution of Gotti's organization. The combination of electronic surveillance, financial analysis, and cooperating witness testimony that proved successful in his case has become standard practice in organized crime investigations throughout the United States. International law enforcement agencies have also adopted similar approaches in their efforts to fight organized crime in other countries. The techniques developed by American federal prosecutors during the 1980s and 1990s have been exported to Europe, Asia, and other regions where traditional organized crime organizations continue to operate. The impact of John Gotti's criminal career on his family members shows the human cost of organized crime, leadership that extends far beyond the immediate participants in criminal activities. His wife, children, and grandchildren have struggled for decades with the legacy of his choices, facing legal challenges, social stigma, and internal conflicts that continue to shape their lives. Victoria Gotti's experience as the wife of America's most famous crime boss shows the particular challenges faced by family members who did not directly take part in criminal activities, but who cannot escape their connection with organized crime. Her efforts to keep normal family relationships while dealing with constant media attention and law enforcement watching required amazing personal strength and resilience. The money results of John Gotti's criminal career created additional problems for family members. Federal prosecutors pursued civil forfeiture, actions designed to recover assets that they argued were gotten from criminal activities. These legal proceedings forced the family to defend their homes, bank accounts, and other property while dealing with the emotional trauma of Gotti's imprisonment and death. Victoria's public statements about her husband's career reveal the complex emotions experienced by family members of organized crime figures. She consistently kept his innocence of the specific charges for which he was found guilty, while accepting that his lifestyle and associations had created problems for the entire family. Her efforts to protect their children from the negative results of their father's reputation required constant watchfulness and careful management of their public appearances. The younger Gotti children attended private schools under assumed names, moved often to avoid media attention, and were taught to avoid discussing family matters with outsiders. However, these protective measures could not completely shield the children from the reality of their father's criminal career. John Gotti Jr.'s decision to follow his father into organized crime activities created a new cycle of legal troubles that extended the family's involvement with law enforcement into the next generation. The younger Gotti's prosecution and conviction on federal racketeering charges shows the intergenerational effects of organized crime involvement. Despite his father's imprisonment and obvious awareness of the results of criminal activities, John Jr. chose to pursue the same path that had destroyed his father's life and freedom. His decision reflects both the powerful attraction of organized crime culture for young men raised within it and the practical difficulties faced by family members trying to establish legal careers while bearing the Gotti name. The combination of limited opportunities in legal employment and the availability of quick income through criminal activities created reasons that prove stronger than the obvious risks. The legal troubles faced by multiple family members also show the continuing interest of federal law enforcement in the Gotti family's activities. Prosecutors pursued cases against John Jr., his brother Peter, and other relatives with an intensity that reflected both their actual criminal involvement and their symbolic importance as representatives of their father's legacy. Victoria Gotti, the couple's daughter, chose a different path by pursuing careers in legal entertainment and publishing. Her work as an author and television personality represents an attempt to capitalize on the family's fame while distancing herself from criminal activities. However, her public statements about her father consistently portray him in heroic terms that ignore the harm caused by his criminal career. The youngest Gotti children faced unique challenges as they reached adulthood during the peak years of media, attention surrounding their father's trials and imprisonment. Their attempts to establish normal careers and family lives were made harder by their surname's connection with organized crime and continuing public interest in their father's story. The psychological impact of growing up as John Gotti's children cannot be fully measured, but family, friends, and relatives describe young people who struggled with conflicting emotions about their father's legacy. They experienced pride in his strength and loyalty, while at the same time recognizing that his choices had caused unmeasurable harm to innocent people and to their own family. The extended Gotti family, including John's siblings and their children, also faced results from his criminal career. Some family members embraced their connection with organized crime, while others tried to distance themselves from criminal activities and build legal lives. The neighborhood communities where the Gotti family lived and operated experienced their own complex reactions to his career and its aftermath. Some residents viewed him as a folk hero who had achieved success and respect despite his humble origins. Others resented the violence, corruption, and law enforcement attention that his activities brought to their neighborhoods. Local businesses in areas controlled by Gotti's organization faced particular challenges during and after his criminal career. Some legal business owners had benefited from his protection and his organization's spending, but they also suffered from the extortion, scaring, and corruption that went along with his operations. The long-term impact of Gotti's career on these communities reflects broader questions about the relationship between organized crime and the neighborhoods where crime families operate. While criminal organizations provide some services and keep some degree of order, they also create environments where violence is commonplace, corruption is widespread, and legal economic development is held back. Educational institutions attended by Gotti family members faced their own challenges in dealing with the media attention and security concerns connected with enrolling children from famous organized crime families. School administrators had to balance the educational needs of these students with the practical difficulties created by their family connections. The medical care provided to John Gotti during his final illness also shows the complex practical and ethical issues that arise when famous criminals require expensive treatment. Hospital staff, federal prison officials, and government administrators had to navigate competing pressures while trying to provide appropriate care within security limits and public watching. Religious institutions that served the Gotti family faced similar dilemmas when asked to provide traditional services for family events. Catholic churches in their neighborhoods had to balance their mission of serving all parishioners with concerns about appearing to endorse or legitimize criminal activities. The continuing public interest in the Gotti family story has created ongoing challenges for family members looking for privacy and normal lives. Books, movies, television shows, and documentaries about John Gotti's career make sure that his children and grandchildren cannot escape their connection with his criminal legacy. However, some family members have tried to use this public interest constructively, taking part in educational programs designed to warn young people about the final results of criminal involvement. Their first-hand knowledge of organized crime's impact on families provides unique perspectives that complement traditional law enforcement approaches to crime prevention. The money legacy of John Gotti's criminal career continues to affect family members decades after his death. Legal challenges to assets supposedly gotten from criminal activities. Ongoing civil litigation related to his organization's actions. And the practical difficulties of establishing legal income sources while bearing the Gotti name create persistent economic pressures. These challenges show broader issues faced by families of organized crime figures throughout American history. The children and grandchildren of criminals often struggle with the competing demands of family loyalty and social acceptance. Forced to choose between embracing their heritage and rejecting the values and relationships that shaped their early lives. More than 2 decades after John Gotti's death, his story continues to interest the American public and influence popular culture representations of organized crime. His life has become a template for fictional crime bosses, while his real-world impact on law enforcement, organized crime, and American society provides lessons that extend far beyond the criminal justice system. The change of Gotti from a living criminal into a cultural legend began during his lifetime and sped up after his death. His combination of charm, violence, intelligence, and final defeat creates a narrative arc that satisfies basic human interests in stories about power, ambition, and moral results. Popular culture representations of Gotti and organized crime generally emphasize the glamorous aspects of his lifestyle while reducing the harm caused by his criminal activities. Movies and television shows about crime bosses often portray them as anti-heroes, whose violence serves understandable purposes and whose loyalty to family and friends redeems their criminal behavior. This romanticized portrayal reflects broader American cultural attitudes toward successful criminals, particularly those who appear to challenge authority and achieve wealth through personal courage and intelligence. Gotti's ability to defeat federal prosecutors during the 1980s reinforced these cultural narratives by suggesting that individual determination could overcome institutional power. However, the final failure of Gotti's criminal career also serves cultural functions by showing that criminal success is temporary and that legal institutions eventually triumph over individual criminals, regardless of their skill or resources. His imprisonment and death provide moral resolution that satisfies audiences' need for justice, while allowing them to enjoy the earlier portions of his story. The academic study of Gotti's career has contributed to broader understanding of organized crime structure, leadership dynamics, and the effectiveness of various law enforcement strategies. Criminologists, sociologists, and legal scholars continue to analyze the wide documentation created by his prosecutions to develop theories about criminal organization behavior. Research based on Gotti's career has influenced policy decisions about resource allocation for organized crime investigations, the development of witness protection programs, and the putting in place of electronic surveillance abilities. The successes and failures of law enforcement efforts against his organization provide practical lessons for contemporary crime control strategies. International law enforcement agencies have studied American experiences with organized crime prosecutions, including the Gotti cases, to develop their own approaches to fighting criminal organizations. The techniques and legal frameworks developed during the 1980s and 1990s have been adapted for use against organized crime groups in Europe, Asia, and other regions. The legal precedents established during Gotti's prosecutions continue to influence contemporary criminal cases involving complex organizations, electronic surveillance, and cooperating witness testimony. Court decisions from his appeals have been cited in hundreds of later cases involving similar issues. However, the specific law enforcement strategies that proved successful against traditional organized crime families have proven less effective against contemporary criminal organizations that operate differently from the hierarchical territorial groups that Gotti represented. Modern criminal organizations tend to be more flexible, less centralized, and more internationally oriented than traditional crime families. They rely more heavily on technology, financial manipulation, and corruption of legal institutions, rather than the territorial control and physical violence that characterized earlier times. These changes reflect both the evolution of criminal opportunities in the global economy and the lessons learned from the prosecution of figures like Gotti. Contemporary criminal leaders understand that keeping low profiles and avoiding the kind of celebrity status that finally destroyed Gotti is essential for long-term success. The neighborhood communities that were once controlled by traditional organized crime families have also evolved in ways that make old-style criminal leadership less workable. Urban renewal, economic development, and changing demographics have changed the social conditions that supported territorial crime organizations. However, the cultural values and behavioral patterns connected with organized crime continue to influence some communities, particularly those with historical connections to traditional crime families. The emphasis on loyalty, respect, and violent resolution of disputes continues in some areas even after the decline of formal criminal organizations. Educational institutions have put materials from Gotti's career into criminology courses, law enforcement training programs, and public policy courses. His story provides concrete examples of abstract concepts related to criminal justice, organizational behavior, and the intersection of legal and illegal activities. Law enforcement agencies continue to use case studies based on Gotti's organization to train investigators in techniques for breaking into complex criminal businesses. The combination of surveillance, financial analysis, and witness cooperation that proved successful in his prosecution has become standard practice in organized crime investigations. The media coverage of Gotti's career also provides lessons for journalists covering organized crime and other complex criminal activities. The balance between public interest in criminal stories and the potential for such coverage to glamorize criminal behavior remains a challenging issue for news organizations. The ethical questions raised by Gotti's story extend beyond criminal justice to broader issues about American society's relationship with violence, authority, and success. His career lights up contradictions in cultural values that at the same time condemn criminal behavior and admire successful criminals. These contradictions reflect deeper tensions in American culture between individual achievement and social responsibility, between skepticism of authority and respect for legal institutions, and between admiration for strength and recognition of the harm caused by violence. The continuing interest in Gotti's story suggests that these cultural tensions remain unresolved and that his career continues to serve as a focal point for broader discussions about power, morality, and justice in American society. His legacy also raises questions about the relationship between legal and illegal success in American culture. Gotti's ability to achieve wealth, respect, and power through criminal activities challenges assumptions about the necessity of legal behavior for social advancement. However, his final defeat and the destruction of his family's well-being also shows the long-term costs of criminal success and the clear superiority of legal achievement over illegal alternatives. As we reach the end of this complete examination of John Gotti's life and legacy, we find ourselves facing a figure who embodies both the appeal and the final futility of the American criminal dream. His story, spanning 6 decades of dramatic social change, provides a lens through which we can examine the evolution of organized crime, law enforcement, and American society itself. John Gotti died as he had lived, defiant, unrepentant, and loyal to principles that had both raised him to amazing heights and condemned him to a shameful end. His refusal to cooperate with federal prosecutors, even when facing life imprisonment and terminal illness, showed a consistency of character that his admirers viewed as noble and his critics saw as destructively stubborn. The change of a poor kid from the Bronx into the most powerful crime boss in America required exceptional intelligence, charm, and ruthlessness. Gotti possessed all these qualities in abundance, but he also possessed the psychological blind spots and cultural limitations that made his downfall bound to happen. His belief that respect could only be earned through violence, that loyalty must be complete regardless of results, and that legal institutions were merely obstacles to be overcome rather than basic aspects of civilized society, reflected values that were both his greatest strengths and his final weakness. The world that produced John Gotti. The ethnic neighborhoods of mid-20th century New York, with their tight-knit communities, limited economic opportunities, and parallel systems of justice, has largely disappeared. The social conditions that made traditional organized crime possible have been changed by economic development, demographic change, and evolving law enforcement abilities. However, the human qualities that made Gotti successful, leadership ability, smart intelligence, and the capacity to inspire loyalty, remain valuable in both legal and illegal contexts. His story shows both the potential and the limitations of these qualities when applied to criminal businesses. The law enforcement techniques that finally brought down Gotti represent one of the great success stories in the history of American criminal justice. The development of RICO laws, electronic surveillance abilities, and witness protection programs created tools that completely changed the balance of power between organized crime and law enforcement. However, these same techniques have raised important questions about privacy rights, government surveillance powers, and the appropriate balance between public safety and individual liberties. The legal and technological abilities developed to fight organized crime have implications that extend far beyond their original purposes. The media phenomenon surrounding Gotti's career reflects broader changes in American culture during the late 20th century. His change from criminal defendant to celebrity shows the power of television, the public's interest in larger-than-life personalities, and the complex relationship between fame and fame for being bad in modern society. His story also shows the double-edged nature of celebrity in the criminal world. The fame that improved his authority within organized crime and provided him with resources for legal defense finally contributed to his downfall by making him too well known to ignore and too dangerous to leave free. The human cost of Gotti's criminal career extends far beyond his own fate to include the victims of his organization's violence, the communities terrorized by his operations, and the family members who continue to struggle with his legacy decades after his death. These costs provide moral context for evaluating his achievements and understanding the true price of criminal success. His impact on his own children shows one of the most tragic aspects of organized crime, its tendency to keep itself going across generations. The values and relationships that define criminal organizations often prove more powerful than rational calculations about risk and results, trapping families in cycles of illegal behavior and legal results. The broader social impact of Gotti's career includes both negative effects, increased violence, corruption, and economic harm, and positive results, including better law enforcement abilities and greater public awareness of organized crime's impact on legal society. Perhaps most importantly, Gotti's story marks the end of a time in American organized crime that began with the great immigration waves of the early 20th century and reached its peak during the middle decades of that century. His death symbolically closed the chapter on traditional organized crime, while opening new chapters in the ongoing struggle between criminal organizations and legal institutions. The contemporary criminal landscape has little resemblance to the world that Gotti controlled during the 1980s. Modern criminal businesses are more likely to be international, technology-based, and focused on financial crimes rather than the territorial violence-based operations that characterize traditional organized crime. However, the basic dynamics of criminal organization, the need for leadership, loyalty, and effective management, remain constant across different types of illegal businesses. Gotti's experiences provide insights into these dynamics that remain relevant for understanding contemporary criminal activities. His legacy also includes the cultural impact of his story on American society's understanding of organized crime, criminal justice, and the relationship between individual achievement and social responsibility. The continuing interest in his career reflects broader cultural tensions that his story both lights up and embodies. Educational institutions, law enforcement agencies, and policymakers continue to study Gotti's career for lessons about criminal organization, investigative techniques, and the effectiveness of various law enforcement strategies. His story provides a complete case study that shows both successful and unsuccessful approaches to fighting organized crime. The international dimension of his legacy includes the export of American law enforcement techniques to other countries, facing similar challenges from organized crime groups. The strategies developed to fight Gotti's organization have been adapted for use against criminal businesses in Europe, Asia, and other regions. As we conclude this examination of John Gotti's life and legacy, we must accept both his remarkable achievements and their final meaninglessness. He built a criminal empire that made huge wealth and commanded respect from thousands of associates and rivals. But he died in prison, his organization destroyed, his family's future hurt by his choices. His story serves as both an inspiration and a warning, showing the heights that individual determination and intelligence can achieve while showing the final futility of success built on violence, corruption, and the exploitation of others. The last of the old-school mob bosses, John Gotti represented both the culmination and the end of a uniquely American criminal tradition. His rise and fall light up basic questions about power, morality, and justice that extend far beyond the criminal justice system to include broader issues about the nature of success and failure in American society. In the end, John Gotti's greatest achievement may be the lessons his life provides about the true cost of criminal success and the clear superiority of legal achievement over illegal alternatives. His story, complete with all its drama, tragedy, and moral complexity, stands as one of the most instructive cautionary tales in the history of American organized crime. The Teflon Don is gone, but the questions raised by his amazing life continue to challenge our understanding of crime, justice, and the American dream itself. His legacy serves as a permanent reminder that in the battle between law and lawlessness, between civilization and criminal chaos, the final victory always belongs to justice, even when that victory requires decades to achieve and exacts terrible price from all involved. John Joseph Gotti, Jr., born October 27, 1940, died June 10, 2002, crime boss, husband, father, folk hero, cautionary tale. He was all of these things and more, but perhaps most importantly, he was the last of his kind, marking the end of a time that will never come again in American criminal history. The streets of New York are quieter now, the social clubs shuttered, the neighborhood bosses replaced by international criminal networks that operate in shadows far deeper than any traditional organized crime Lee ever knew. The world that made John Gotti possible has vanished, but the story of his rise and fall remains, a testament to the enduring American interest in larger-than-life figures who challenge authority, achieve the impossible, and finally pay the price for their defiance of the law. In the history of American crime, John Gotti stands alone, the last Don, the final chapter of a story that began in the tenements of New York and ended in the sterile confines of a federal prison medical center. His tale is complete, his legacy secure, his place in history assured. He was, in every sense of the word, the last of his kind. And so that was the story of John Gotti, the man the world came to know as the Teflon Don, a figure who walked the thin line between myth and reality, celebrated by some as a street legend, condemned by others as a ruthless criminal. He was flashy, unafraid, and in his own way, larger than life. But like every story from the underworld, no matter how high the rise, the fall always comes. For John Gotti, Prison bars became the end of an empire that once seemed untouchable. When we close the chapter on men like Gotti, it is more than just history. It is a reminder of how power can blind us, how fame can become a prison, and how the streets rarely forgive those who claim to own them. Gangsters like Gotti lived fast, but they rarely lived free. And yet, we keep listening to their stories. Why? Because they hold a strange mirror up to our own lives. They force us to ask questions about loyalty, ambition, greed, and survival, about what we are willing to sacrifice to chase a dream, and whether in the end it is ever really worth it. If you made it this far into the story, it means something inside you connects to these late-night tailies. Maybe it is curiosity, maybe it is fascination, or maybe, just maybe, you find a little peace in hearing the truth laid bare while the rest of the world sleeps. That is what this channel is about. Sleepy Gangster Stories is not just about names like Gotti, Lansky, Luciano, or Capone. It is about you, the listener. It is about giving you a space to sit back, close your eyes, and let the weight of history, crime, and consequence unfold in front of you without judgment, without noise, without distraction, just the voice, the shadows, and the story. If you enjoyed this dive into John Gotti's world, I invite you to join me on this journey. Subscribe to Sleepy Gangster Stories, where every day we pull back the curtain on another figure who shaped the underworld. Some you will know, others you may have never heard of, but every single one will leave you with something to think about long after the story ends. So here's what I ask of you. If you found value in tonight's story, take a moment now before you drift off to sleep to like this video. Not because the algorithm demands it, but because it tells me personally that this work matters to you. That the hours spent researching, writing, and shaping these stories into something you can feel were worth it. And when you subscribe, you will never miss a single episode. The underworld is vast, and we have only just begun. But it does not stop there. I want to hear from you. Was John Gotti a criminal mastermind who built his own kingdom? Or was he just a man consumed by the spotlight he could not escape? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Share what this story made you think about. Did it remind you of something in your own life? Did it shift how you view loyalty, power, or fame? Every comment becomes part of the bigger story we are writing together. And if you want to take it a step further, share this video with someone who would appreciate it. A friend who loves history, a relative who remembers these names, or someone who just enjoys a late-night watch before drifting off. Because this channel grows one story at a time, one viewer at a time, one recommendation at a time. For me, this is not just content, it is a craft. Each script is built from the ground up. Each word chosen to not just inform, but to transport you, to pull you into smoky back rooms, neon-lit streets, and whispered conversations in the dead of night. To remind you that history is not just something we read, it is something we feel. And here is the truth. I can only keep creating these stories with your support. Your likes, your comments, your subscriptions. They are not just numbers. They are the fuel that keeps this channel alive. They are the signal that says, yes, keep going. Tell us more. So, before you close your eyes tonight, do 3 simple things. Like this video, subscribe to Sleepy Gangster Stories, and leave a comment with your thoughts. That is it. 3 small steps that mean the world on this side of the microphone. Until then, sleep well, stay curious, and remember, the streets always keep their secrets. This is Sleepy Gangster Stories, and our journey is only just beginning. SSS.